Hello, my name is Angel, and let us talk about brain anatomy. Alright, so what is brain? The brain is made up of billions of nerve cells called neurons and supporting cells. It's protected by cranium. I've already created a video on skull anatomy. You're more than welcome to take a look at it. So the brain is protected by the cranium, the bones of the head, and it's covered by three membranes called meninges. The brain is about the size of two clenched fists and weighs around 3 pounds. The human brain is most complex organ in the body, control nearly every function of the body, which includes thought. Your thought processes are controlled by brain. The brain is the source of human intelligence and is responsible for thinking, learning, problem solving, and memory. All right. So memorization, solution provision, and also learning, thinking are all ruled by brain, right? Movement, the brain also controls movement, voluntary movement, balance, and posture, right? Senses, the brain interprets the information received from the 5 senses. The body functions, brain regulates breathing, heart rate, temperature, hunger, and sleep cycles, right? All right, so brain's also responsible for controlling emotions and processing emotions. Okay. All right. The brain is made up of 3 main parts: cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. Right. The largest part of the brain, controlling thinking, memory, emotion, speech, and voluntary movement, are all taken care by cerebrum. Cerebellum controls fine motor movement, balance, and posture. Brainstem controls breathing, heart rate, and the nerves, muscles, used to see, right? Hear, walk, talk, and eat. The brain and spinal cord make up the central nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord make up the CNS, central nervous system. All right, the functions of the brain, as you can see, there are 4 lobes. So this one, the blue region, is the parietal lobe. Knowing right from left, sensation, reading, body orientation, and sensory discrimination. So that is parietal lobe, right? Occipital lobe is responsible for vision, visual reception, and visual interpretation. So that's occipital lobe, right? Frontal lobe is responsible for movement, thinking, initiation, reasoning, judgment, behavior, emotions, memory. The frontal lobe is also responsible for memory, and it's also responsible for speaking. Alright, so the pink part area, this dark pink, is temporal lobe, understanding language, behavior, memory, and hearing, right? Brainstem, consciousness, breathing, blood pressure, heartbeat, right? So that is brainstem. Alright, it's also responsible for alertness, sleep, body temp, digestion, swallowing. And this is exactly why you cannot actually keep your head straight. Sometimes you literally fall asleep. But if you try to keep your head straight, then chances are you'll feel like you're alert and you're awake, right? Alright, so this area here, this part, is a cerebellum. Cerebellum is responsible for balance, coordination, and fine muscle control. So balance, coordination, and fine muscle control. Alright, embryological development of brain. So brain and spinal cord develop from the ectodermal neural tube. The anterior part of neural tube expands along with the associated neural crest tissue. That's the anterior part of neural tube, along with associated neural crest tissue. Constrictions in this expanded tube soon appear, creating 3 regions called primary brain vesicles: prosencephalon, mesencephalon, and rhombencephalon, right? Both prosencephalon and rhombencephalon subdivide further, forming secondary brain vesicles, right? So pro and rhombo create secondary brain vesicles, right? The prosencephalon or forebrain gives rise to telencephalon and diencephalon, and the rhombencephalon or hindbrain develops into metencephalon and myelencephalon. The walls of these brain regions develop into nervous tissue, while the hollow interior of the tube is transformed into various ventricles, that is fluid-filled spaces, right? Right. So the various brain vesicles give rise to the following adult structures. Now the telencephalon, is distant encephalon. Encephalon is brain. Develops into cerebrum and lateral ventricle. So cerebrum, right? The largest part of brain is cerebrum. Diencephalon, all right, forms the thalamus and hypothalamus, epithalamus, and the third ventricle, right? Mesencephalon, is middle encephalon, middle brain, gives rise to the midbrain and aqueduct of the midbrain, right? Metencephalon gives rise to pons, it becomes cerebellum, and upper part of the fourth ventricle. Myelencephalon, myle means marrow, encephalon is brain, right? Forms the medulla oblongata and lower part of the fourth ventricle. The expanded neural crest tissue becomes prominent in the head development. Most of the protective structures of the brain, that is, most of the bones of the skull associated connective tissue and meningeal membranes arise from this expanded neural crest tissue. Alright, so most of the protective structures of the brain, for example, the bones of the skull associated connective tissue, meningeal membranes arise from this expanded neural crest tissue, right? Alright. So as you can see, this is the coronal view. This is 4 weeks, 5 weeks, this is 6 months, right? Vesicle, cephalon, neural tube differentiates into brain vesicles. Brain vesicles, there's 4 weeks primary third, 5 weeks secondary 5. So prosencephalon is telencephalon and diencephalon. Mesencephalon is mesencephalon, but rhomboencephalon is metencephalon, and myelencephalon. Myle is marrow, we just learned, right? Flexure, cephalic, pontine, and cervical, right? As you can see, this is prosencephalon, mesencephalon to mes, rhomboencephalon, it goes to met and myelencephalon, and that's neural tube. This particular thing is neural tube, right? So, cephalic fixture, cervical fixture, cephalic fourth ventricle roof, that's cervical fixture, and that's fourth ventricle, and that's pontine flexure, right? As you can see, in 6 months, you will see intellect explodes. This particular area is cerebrum. Diencephalon creates the thalamic areas, hypothalamus, thalamus, epithalamus. Mesencephalon is midbrain. It's easy to remember. Metencephalon, met is pons and cerebellum, right? Pons and cerebellum, right here. Cerebellum, right here. Myencephalon is medulla oblongata, right? Neural tube is the spinal cord, right? As you can see, this is neural tube, cerebellum, pons, right? This is where the cerebellum is, that's where the pons is. This is exactly where you'll find most of the thalamus areas, hypo, epi, and thalamus, right? So, neural tube runs length of embryo until month 3 when spine growth starts to outspace spinal cord growth, right? Alright, so the 4 principal parts of the brain are brainstem, cerebellum, diencephalon, and cerebrum, right? So what you see here is a sagittal plane view. Okay, doesn't matter where. It's a sagittal. It's not a mid-sagittal. It's sagittal. Alright? So as you can see, this particular area is a spinal cord. This is cerebellum, right? This particular thing is cerebellum, right? This area is medulla oblongata. This is pons. This area is pons. This area is pituitary gland. This is cerebellum. Diencephalon is thalamus. This particular area in shape of egg is the thalamus, right? Hypothalamus. This particular area is hypothalamus. This area. This little structure here, the part of epithalamus here, is pineal gland. Alright, so this area, thalamus, hypothalamus, pineal gland. Pineal gland is a part of epithalamus. Brainstem, midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. So this particular area, 1, 2, that's the midbrain. This area here is the pons. Medulla oblongata, this is medulla oblongata, and that's a spinal cord. And like I said earlier, that's cerebellum. So cerebellum, cerebrum, diencephalon, right? And the brain stem. They are the 4 main parts of the brain. Alright, again, this is sagittal medial view, cerebrum, cerebellum, right? spinal cord, medulla oblongata. This area, this particular area is pons. These two are midbrain. As a hypothalamus, that is the thalamus here, right? All right. What are the protective coverings of the brain? Cranial bones and cranial meninges protect the brain, right? That's a frontal plane, right? Okay, so starting, this is a superior view, right? From here, we are looking from here, superior view. Periosteal layer. This particular green layer is a periosteal layer. The second layer is meningeal layer, right? As you can see right here, this little space here is subarachnoid space, right? This here is arachnoid villus, this here. That's falx cerebri, this green area. That's the cerebral cortex. As you can see right here, that is the pia mater. That's arachnoid matter. This particular area is arachnoid matter. This, if you see 1 and 2, that's the dura mater. All these make cranial meninges. So dura mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater are all meninges. This is the parietal bone. This particular bone is the parietal bone. And that here is the skin, right? This is your skin. Alright, let's do it one more time, right? This is a superior view. As you can see, this area, the space here is subarachnoid space. This area is falx cerebri. This particular area is pia mater, cerebral cortex, arachnoid matter right here. We also have dura mater. This is parietal bone. You know, we saw other picture. Superior sagittal sinus, right? So this is a superior view. This is the anterior view of the frontal section, right? All right. Okay. Dura mater. This is falx cerebri. This is the parietal bone. Superior sagittal sinus. All right. Inferior sagittal sinus here. Tentorium cerebelli. This area here is tentorium cerebelli. This is a straight sinus. That's transverse sinus right here. This is falx cerebelli again, right? Occipital bone. This particular area is the occipital bone. I have already created another video on skull anatomy. You're welcome to take a look at it. This is a sphenoid bone, right? This is sphenoid bone. That's frontal bone, right? This sagittal section of extensions of the dura mater. What are the 3 layers of cranial meninges from superficial to deep? All right, dura, arachnoid, and pia, from superficial to deep, right? So there are 3 layers, okay? Okay, so let's learn about brain blood flow, okay? The blood flows to the brain mainly via the internal carotid and vertebral arteries. The dural venous sinuses drain into the internal jugular veins to return blood from the head to the heart. The brain represents only 2% of the total body weight, but it consumes about 20% of the oxygen and glucose used by the body, even when you're resting, right? And this is exactly why when we are studying, we actually get hungry because we are emotionally exhausted, right? Arterial blood supply to the brain, right? So as you can see, this is the internal carotid artery. It is rising, all right? This is the vertebral artery coming from the vertebrae. This is the basilar artery, right? This is the posterior cerebellar artery. This is the medial cerebral artery. This is the anterior cerebral artery, and this is the ophthalmic artery. It provides blood supply to the eyes, right? All right. So when we have a blood supply, we have to have a venous system, right? So dural venous sinuses drain into the internal jugular veins to return blood from the head to the heart, right? So well, obviously, when we have blood supply, we have to drain the blood too, right? So superior sagittal sinus, this is inferior sagittal sinus, great cerebral vein, straight transverse, confluence of sinuses, right? And this is how it takes a circle and it goes back. Internal jugular vein, right? And this goes back to the heart, all right? The blood-brain barrier consists mainly of tight junctions that seal together the endothelial cells of blood-brain capillaries, and thick basement membrane that surrounds the capillaries, right? So blood-brain barrier consists of mainly tight junctions that seal together. So they're like tight junctions, the mortar between the bricks, right? Astrocytes are one type of neuroglia. They're neuroglial cells. The process of many astrocytes press up against the capillaries and secrete chemicals that maintain the tightness of the tight junctions. So, what do the astrocytes do? They secrete chemicals that maintain the tightness. Trauma, certain toxin, and inflammation can cause a breakdown of blood-brain barrier. Large molecules can slip between the interlocking endothelial cells because of their size. Water-soluble molecules can't easily pass through your BBB because its cell membranes are lipid-based, right? Which repels water-soluble molecules if large or water-soluble molecules, including nutrients, need to get through. They need transportation to help them across, right? So for larger soluble molecules, the blood-brain barrier is so tight that it won't allow to pass through. However, alcohol, anesthetics, antidepressant medication, anxiolytics, anti-anxiety medications, antipsychotic medications, medication that treat seizures or epilepsies, caffeine, acetaminophen, and most non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs, sedative, hypnotics such as barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and similar drugs can very easily pass through. Right? This is exactly why they say when you drink and drive, your judgment is impaired. Why? Because it has a direct impact on your brain, right? Okay, pathogens such as bacteria or viruses and many toxic substances generally cannot go through your BBB. However, there are exceptional cases that may go through your BBB. So don't just accept that information as is. All right. So normal blood cells versus brain blood cells, right? So as you can see, this is a normal blood cell, right? This is a blood vessel. This is a waterline pore, right? So how the water goes in, the pore passage, lipid-soluble substances. This is a brain blood vessel, right? This is a blood vessel. These are tight junctions. No pores. Why? Because they create barriers. This is lipid-soluble substances, carrier-mediated transport, right? So these are the glial brain cells support the barrier. Why do they support and how do they do it? By secreting chemicals. That's what we learned, right? Okay. All right. So smooth muscles, brain, endothelium. These are the endothelium cells. These are astrocytes. This is pericyte, and this is blood. As you can see, they're so tightly connected. Pia mater, arterial, capillary, right? So as you can see, pericyte. All right. As you can see, this is so tightly connected that nothing goes through them, right? We see the same thing here. Endothelial cells, as you can see here, we have tight junctions, right? This is blood. This is astrocyte endophyte, right? And you see how it gets stuck to it so nothing can pass through. These are tight junctions, okay? So as you can see, this is a blood capillary. When we cut the blood capillary, this is what we'll see. The cross section, this is what we'll see. Okay, so blood-brain barrier is formed mainly by tight junctions of brain capillary endothelial cells. Okay, BCEC, brain capillary endothelial cells. CSF, cerebral spinal fluid. CSF is a clear, colorless liquid composed primarily of water that protects the brain and spinal cord from chemical and physical injuries, right? So CSF is a clear, colorless liquid composed primarily of water that protects the brain and the spinal cord, okay, from chemical and physical injuries. It also carries small amounts of oxygen, glucose, and other needed chemicals from the blood to the neurons and the neuroglia. CSF continuously circulates through cavities in the brain and spinal cord and around the brain and spinal cord in the subarachnoid space, the space between the arachnoid matter and the pia mater, right? So CSF continuously circulates through cavities in the brain and spinal cord and around the brain and spinal cord in subarachnoid space. The total volume of CSF is 80 to 150 milliliter, 3 to 5 ounce in an adult. CSF contains small amounts of glucose, proteins, lactic acid, urea, cations, sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and anions, chlorine and hydrogen carbonate, right? It also contains some white blood cells, right? So it contains the other minerals, but it also contains white blood cells. There is one lateral ventricle in each hemisphere of the cerebrum, right? So there's one lateral ventricle. Anteriorly, the lateral ventricles are separated by a thin membrane called a septum pellucidum, right? So lateral ventricles are separated by a thin membrane called as septum pellucidum. The third ventricle is a narrow slit-like cavity along the midline superior to the hypothalamus and between the right and left halves of thalamus. The fourth ventricle lies between the brainstem and the cerebellum. Location of ventricles within a transparent brain. One interventricular foramen on each side connects a lateral ventricle to the third ventricle, and the aqueduct of the midbrain connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. The ventricles are cavities within the brain that are filled with cerebrospinal fluid, right? So this is cerebrum, fourth ventricle here, the lateral aperture, cerebellum, the median aperture, central canal, this is spinal cord, medulla oblongata, right? In this particular area is pons, aqueduct of the midbrain, third ventricle. Most of the ventricles, are very transparent. You can't see them, right? So location of ventricles within a transparent brain. Lateral ventricles, interventricular foramen, and this is third ventricle. So which region is anterior to the fourth ventricle? All right, so I believe pons would be the answer. And which region is posterior? Oh, I believe cerebellum would be that answer. Okay. Formation of CSF in the ventricles. The majority of CSF production is from choroid plexus, networks of blood capillaries in the walls of ventricles. Ependymal cells secrete water from blood plasma to produce CSF, and they are joined by tight junctions cover capillaries of choroid plexus. Blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier permits certain substances to enter the CSF, but excludes others, protecting the brain and spinal cord from potentially harmful blood-borne substances. The blood cerebrospinal fluid barrier is formed by tight junctions of ependymal cells. The CSF has three basic functions in helping to maintain homeostasis. Mechanical protection. CSF serves as a shock-absorbing medium that protects the delicate tissues of the brain and spinal cord from jolts that would otherwise cause them to hit bony walls of the cranial cavity and vertebral canal. The fluid also buoys the brain so that it floats, or so there is a buoyancy. That's what they're saying. Floats in the cranial cavity, right? The fluid also buoys the brain so it floats in the cranial cavity. All right. So mechanical protection. CSF serves as a shock-absorbing medium that protects the delicate tissues of the brain and spinal cord from jolts, right? All right. So as you can see, we saw this earlier. Superior sagittal sinus, and the blue part that you see is all CSF. As you can see, it covers the whole area. Central canal of spinal cord, that is a spinal cord, that's a skull. Subarachnoid space, arachnoid villi, ventricles of the brain. 1, 2, 3. This blue area is CSF, okay? So as you can see, it serves as a shock-absorbing medium. Chemical protection. CSF provides an optimal chemical environment for accurate neuronal signaling. Even slight changes in the ionic composition of CSF within the brain can seriously disrupt production of action potentials and postsynaptic potentials. So CSF provides an optimal chemical environment for accurate neuronal signal, right? Even slight changes in the ionic composition of CSF within the brain can seriously disrupt production of action potentials. Circulation. CSF is a medium for minor exchange of nutrients and waste products between the blood and the adjacent nervous tissue. So the circulation CSF is a medium for minor exchange of nutrients and waste products between blood and adjacent nervous tissue. So it also helps with circulation, mechanical protection, and chemical protection. So CSF circulates through brain and spinal cord in the complex system that includes the ventricle, subarachnoid space, and parenchyma. The ventricle, CSF is produced in the choroid plexus of the lateral ventricles, then flows through the interventricular foramina to the third ventricle. From there, it passes through the cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. Subarachnoid space, CSF flows from the fourth ventricle to the subarachnoid space through the median aperture of the fourth ventricle. In the subarachnoid space, CSF circulates in multiple directions. Reabsorption. CSF is reabsorbed into the venous circulation through arachnoid villi, which are structures in the arachnoid matter at a rate of about 20 milliliter per hour for 80 milliliter per day. Because the rates of formation and reabsorptions are the same, the pressure of CSF normally is constant. For the same reason, the volume of CSF remains constant. CSF circulation is pulsatile, meaning it's driven by systolic pulse wave in the choroidal arteries and respiratory waves. CSF circulation is pulsatile. It's pulsatile as in it would, if you check the movement of CSF, you can actually feel that it pulsated. So 1, 2, 3, 4, like that. It's not a smooth. That's how you feel like. Meaning it's driven by systolic pulse wave in the choroidal arteries and respiratory waves. The CSF is refreshed about every 7 hours or 3 to 4 times a day. Okay, so the flow of cerebrospinal fluid. The CSF is secreted by choroid plexus in each lateral ventricle. Alright, so this is where we are, which are number 1, and it gets secreted by choroid plexus. CSF flows through interventricular foramina into the third ventricle. So it's from second, it goes to the third, right? In the third, the choroid plexus in the third ventricle adds more CSF. So here, more CSF will be added. CSF flows down cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. So from third, it flows down from cerebral aqueduct to the fourth ventricle. From there, it goes to number 5. Choroid plexus in the fourth ventricle adds more CSF. So number 5, it goes to number 6. CSF flows out to lateral apertures and 1 median aperture. So CSF flows out to 2 lateral apertures and 1 median aperture. From 6, it goes to number 7. CSF fills subarachnoid space and bats external surface of the brain and spinal cord. So here, number 7. At arachnoid villi, this particular, CSF is reabsorbed into venous blood of durovenous sinuses. So from here, it gets reabsorbed into venous blood, right? We just learned that it gets refreshed every 7 hours, right? And we also learned that the arachnoid matter, the rate of 20 milliliter per hour, 40, 80 milliliter per day. So the reabsorption, so I mean, you have to keep recycling the CSF too, right? So that's what it is. Alright, so brainstem. The brainstem is the part of the brain between the spinal cord and the diencephalon, right? It consists of 3 structures, alright? Medulla oblongata, so sometimes they just call it medulla. So this is medulla. This is pons. This blue area here is pons. Number 3 is the midbrain here. This particular area is the midbrain. And this whole area here is the brainstem. Here, that's where your spinal cord starts, and that's where your vertebral arteries are coming from, as you can see. Alright, so vertebral arteries, they connect here, and this is the basal artery, right? So that's the cerebral anterior, and then we'll see some here, which is cerebral posterior. Alright, so medulla oblongata. Alright, so this is an inferior view. We're looking from the inferior aspect of the brain, from under it to up. That's what we're seeing. Medulla oblongata in relation to the rest of the brain stem, right? It's anterior. This area is anterior. This area is posterior, right? This is the cerebrum, the largest part of the brain. That's the olfactory bulb. This is olfactory tract, right? It's anterior, so this has to be nose. Pituitary gland, that is optic tract. Okay, this is optic. This is for the eyes. Mammillary body here. These are the mammillary bodies. Cerebral peduncle. This area here is cerebral peduncle. This is midbrain. This here is pons. That here, this little thing, is medulla oblongata. And this area here, this full, is cerebellum. As you can see, this particle is spinal nerve C1. And these are two pyramids, 1 and 2. This area here is medulla oblongata. As you can see, this little here, that's the olive. Okay? So medulla oblongata, also known as medulla, is a small but vital part of the brainstem that connects the brain and the spinal cord. The location is at the base of the skull, just below the pons. Okay? The function, it controls vital functions like breathing, heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion. Structure made up of cells and fibers and contains multiple functional centers. Size about an inch long and widest at the top, where it connects to the pons. Damage to the medulla can be life-threatening and can lead to breathing problems, loss of muscle control, and more. Okay, so if there is a damage to medulla, it can actually cause loss of muscle control. Okay, medulla oblongata is responsible for relaying critical information between the brain and the rest of the nervous system, including sensory, motoric, and proprioceptive information. It also contains the origin of cranial nerves 9, 10, 11, and 12. Alright, so it contains the origin of cranial nerves. Alright. Internal anatomy of medulla oblongata. The pyramids of medulla contain the large motor tracts that run from cerebrum to the spinal cord. Alright, so this is fourth ventricle. That is the vagus nucleus. This is a transverse plane. Alright. The lateral corticospinal tract axons. This spinal nerve C1. This spinal cord. Right. Hypoglossal nerve. This is vagus nerve here. As you can see, this is the choroid plexus. Right. Okay. This particular here, the crossing, is called as decussation of the pyramid. So if you can see crisscross, and that is the decussations of the pyramid. And these two are the pyramids, this and this are the pyramids. Inferior olivary nucleus. So this and that. This particular is inferior olivary nucleus, right below the olives. That's why. This particular is the vagus nerve. Okay. That's the hypoglossal nerve. And these are the two pyramids. Alright, so what are the function of medulla? Connects the higher levels of the brain to the spinal cord, responsible for regulating several basic functions of the ANS, which include respiration, chemoreception, right? Cardiac center, sympathetic, parasympathetic nervous system, vasomotor center, baroreceptors, right? Reflex centers of vomiting, coughing, sneezing, and swallowing. So medulla has a very important function, right? Alright, so these are pons. That's the pyramid. That's the olive. Anterior fissure. Venterolateral sulcus. These are the decussations. So right crosses with left and left crosses with right. Okay. Posterolateral sulcus. This here is a lateral sulcus. Okay. Medulla contains nuclei associated with the following 5 pairs of cranial nerves, right? We just saw some nerves connected. Vestibulocochlear nerve, so that's the cranial nerve. Number 8, several nuclei in the medulla receive sensory input from and provide motor output to cochlea of the internal ear via the vestibulocochlear nerves. These nerves convey impulses relating to hearing. Glossopharyngeal cranial number 9 nerve nuclei in the medulla relay sensory and motor impulses related to the taste, swallowing, and salivation via glossopharyngeal nerve. Vagus nerve number 10 nuclei in the medulla receive sensory impulses from and provide motor impulses to the pharynx and larynx and many thoracic abdominal viscera via the vagus nerve. Accessory nerve number 11 cranial portion. These fibers are a part of the vagus nerves. Nuclei in the medulla are the origin for the nerve impulses that control swallowing via the vagus nerve cranial portion of the accessory nerves. The hypoglossal nerve number 12 nuclei in the medulla are the origin for the nerve impulses that control tongue movements during speech and swallowing via the hypoglossal nerves. Alright, so parts of medulla oblongata, we saw decussations of pyramids, right? The crisscross. Just superior to the junction of the medulla with the spinal cord, 90% of the axons in the left pyramid cross to the right side, and 90% of the axons in the right pyramid cross to the left side. This crossing is called as decussation of pyramids and explains why each side of the brain controls voluntary movements on the opposite side of the body, right? So right would help you with voluntary movements on your left, and left will help you voluntary movements with the right. That's the decussation of the pyramid. Nuclei. The medulla also contains several nuclei. Recall that nucleus is a collection of neuronal cell bodies within the CNS, right? So some of these nuclei control vital body functions. The CV, cardiovascular center. The cardiovascular center regulates the rate and force of the heartbeat and diameter of the blood vessels. Vomiting center. Vomiting center of the medulla causes vomiting. Deglutition center. The deglutition center of the medulla promotes deglutition, swallowing of a mass of the food that has moved from the oral cavity of the mouth into the pharynx. Olive, just lateral to each pyramid, is an oval-shaped swelling called an olive. Inferior olivary nucleus. Within the olive is an inferior olivary nucleus which receives input from the cerebral cortex, a red nucleus of the midbrain and spinal cord. Parts of medulla oblongata, gracile nucleus and cuneate nucleus. Nuclei associated with sensation of touch, pressure, vibration, and conscious proprioception are located in the posterior part of the medulla. These nuclei are the right and left gracile nucleus and cuneate nucleus. The medial lemniscus, the axons ascend to the thalamus in the band of white matter called medial lemniscus. The gustatory nucleus of the medulla is a part of gustatory pathway. From the tongue to the brain, it receives gustatory input from the taste buds of the tongue, right? Alright, so cochlear nuclei. The cochlear nuclei of the medulla are part of the auditory pathway. From the inner ear to the brain, they receive auditory input from the cochlea of the inner ear. Vestibular nuclei. The vestibular nuclei of the medulla and pons are components of equilibrium pathway from the inner ear to the brain. They receive sensory information associated with equilibrium from proprioceptors, receptors that provide information regarding body positions and movements in the vestibular apparatus of the inner ear, right? So we have different parts of oblongata. We have few nuclei, and we also have other parts, the nuclei, cardiovascular center, vomiting center, deglutition center, olives, inferior olivary nucleuses. Alright, so we have nuclei and certain other parts. Clinical relevance. Injury to medulla from a hard blow to the back of the head or upper neck, such as falling back on the eyes, can be fatal. Okay, damage to the medullary respiratory center is particularly serious and can rapidly lead to death. Symptoms of non-fatal injury to medulla may include cranial nerve malfunctions, right? We saw hypoglossal, we saw another one. Which one did we see? Sorry. All right, so we saw hypoglossal, we saw accessory, we saw vagus, glossopharyngeal, and vestibulocochlear, right? So it can impact all the functions that are taken care by these nerves. So on the same side of the body as injury, paralysis, and loss of sensation, on the opposite side of the body, and irregularities in breathing or heart rhythm, right? Because it also takes care of some of the non-voluntary actions as well. All right, so alcohol overdose also suppresses the medullary rhythmicity center, may result in the death. Okay. All right, so brain stem consists of medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. Right, so this is the medulla oblongata. We spoke about olive. We spoke about pyramids. We also spoke about decussation. This is C1, right? This is cerebellum. All right, so we spoke about all that. All right, so pons. All right, so this particular area is the pons. All right, the pons means bridge, right? So this is crus cerebri. All right, this is a facial nerve. That's a trigeminal nerve. This is trochlear nerve. These are pons. That is oculomotor nerve. Here we see pyramidal decussation, right? We saw that. This area here, particular area, is medulla oblongata. We call it medulla, right? Okay, so let's start. That is the abducens nerve. The pons means the bridge, lies directly superior to medulla, right? This is the medulla. This whole area is pons. And anterior to cerebellum, right? So it's right in the anterior side of the cerebellum. And is about 2.5 centimeter, that is 1 inch. Consists of both nuclei and tracts, connects part of the brain with one another with the help of axons. Axons connect right and left sides of the cerebellum. The pons has two major structural components, a ventral region and a dorsal region. So pons has two major structural components, ventral and dorsal. The ventral region forms a large synaptic relay station consisting of scattered gray centers called pontine nuclei, right? So ventral region forms a large synaptic relay station, and it consists of scattered gray centers, pontine nuclei. Sometimes they call it pontine, I call it pontine, okay? All right. Entering and exiting this nuclei are numerous white matter tracts, each of which provides a connection between the cortex, which is the outer layer, of a cerebral hemisphere and that of the opposite hemisphere of the cerebellum. This complex circuitry plays an essential role in coordinating and maximizing the efficiency of voluntary motor output throughout the body. So the complex circuitry play, right, essential role in coordinating and maximizing the efficiency of voluntary motor output. The dorsal region of the pons is more like the other regions of the brainstem, the medulla and the midbrain. It contains ascending and descending tracts along with nuclei of the cranial nerves. Also within the pons is the pontine respiratory group, all right? So this particular area is pons, all right? And it also contains pontine respiratory group together with the medullary respiratory center. The pontine respiratory group helps control breathing, okay? So this particular area is a pontine respiratory group, and it helps with breathing. Okay. The pons also contains nuclei associated with following four pairs of cranial nerves. One's trigeminal V5 nerve, trigeminal nerve number 5. Nuclei in the pons receive sensory impulses from somatic sensations from the head and the face and provide motor impulses that govern chewing via the trigeminal nerve, right? So chewing is something that is also taken care. Abducens nerve number 6. Nuclei in the pons provide motor impulses that control eyeball movements via the abducens nerve, right? Facial nerve number 7. Nuclei in the pons receive sensory impulses from taste and provide motor impulses to regulate secretion of saliva and tears and contraction of muscles of facial expression via the facial nerves. Vestibulocochlear nerve number 8. The nuclei in the pons receive sensory impulses from and provide motor impulses to the vestibular apparatus via the vestibulocochlear nerves. These nerves convey impulses related to balance and equilibrium. Midbrain. The midbrain connects the pons to diencephalon, right? So as you can see, this is the view, all right? So midbrain connects pons to the diencephalon, all right? Alright, the midbrain or mesencephalon extends from pons to the diencephalon and is about 2.5, which is 1 inch long. The aqueduct of the midbrain, cerebral aqueduct, passes through the midbrain, connecting the third vertebral above the fourth vertebral below. Like the medulla and the pons, the midbrain contains both nuclei and tracts, right? The anterior part of the midbrain contains paired bundles of axons known as cerebral peduncles, little feet. Peduncles means little feet. The cerebral peduncles consist of axons of the corticospinal, corticobulbar, and corticopontine tracts, which conduct nerve impulses from motor areas in the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord, medulla, and pons, respectively. The posterior part of the midbrain, called the tectum, which means roof, contains 4 rounded elevations. The 2 superior elevations, nuclei known as superior colliculi, and serve as reflex centers for certain visual activities. Through neural circuits from the retina of the eye to the superior colliculi to the extrinsic eye muscles, visual stimuli elicits eye movements for tracking moving images, such as moving car, and scanning stationary images, as you are doing when you read the whole PowerPoint, right? So visual stimuli elicit eye movements, right? So through neural circuits from the retina of the eye to the superior colliculi to the extrinsic eye muscles, visual stimuli elicit eye movements. The superior colliculi are also responsible for reflexes that govern movements of the head, eyes, and the trunk in response to visual stimuli. The 2 inferior elevations, the inferior colliculi, are part of auditory pathway, relaying impulses from the receptors for hearing in the inner ear to the brain. These 2 nuclei are also reflex centers from the start or reflect sudden movements of the head, eyes, and trunk that occur when you're surprised by loud noise, such as a gunshot. Alright, so the midbrain contains several other nuclei, including the left and right substantia nigra, which are large and dark pigmented. Neurons that release dopamine extending from the substantia nigra to the basal nuclei help control subconscious muscle activities. Loss of these neurons is associated with Parkinson's disease, right? So as you can see, non-motor disorders caused by Parkinson's disease, forced closure of the eyelid, okay, constipation, micturition disorders, sexual problems, increased sweating, okay, bowing of the shoulders, swelling of the feet, okay, difficulty speaking, excessive salivation, difficulty in swallowing, and also respiratory problems, orthostatic hypotension, depression, sleep disorders, and weight loss, right? So loss of these neurons is associated with Parkinson's disease. Also present are the left and right red nuclei, which look reddish due to their rich blood supply and an iron-containing pigment in their neuronal cells bodies. Axons from the cerebellum and cerebral cortex form synapses in the red nuclei, which help control muscular movements. Midbrain, there are still other nuclei in the midbrain associated with 2 pairs of cranial nerves. One is oculomotor, another is trochlear nerve. Nuclei in the midbrain provide motor impulses that control movement of the eyeball, while accessory oculomotor nuclei provide motor control to the smooth muscle that regulate constriction of the pupil and changes in shape of the lens via the oculomotor nerves. The trochlear nerve nuclei in the midbrain provide motor impulses that control movements of the eyeballs via trochlear nerves. Alright, this is the transverse section of the midbrain. As you can see, this is the tectum, that means roof. This is reticular formation, This is what you call medial lemniscus. This is what you call oculomotor number 3, the nerve, corticospinal, corticopontine, and corticobulbar axons. This is what they call substantia nigra, right? We just learned about it. This is red nucleus. This is oculomotor nucleus, right? This particular area is geniculate nucleus. This is aqueduct of the midbrain. Contains mesencephalic nucleus. Periaqueductal gray matter. This particular area. This area here is superior colliculus. Okay. Sagittal section through the brain and spinal cord showing reticular formation, right? So this is reticular activating system, RAS projections to the cerebral cortex. Visual impulses from the eyes, all right? Reticular formation, medulla oblongata, that's the spinal cord. This particular somatic sensory impulses from nociceptors, proprioceptors, and touch receptors. This area is cerebellum. This egg here is thalamus. This area is cerebral cortex. Okay. So reticular formation, okay, the broad region where white matter and gray matter exhibit a net-like arrangement is known as reticular formation. All right, so the broad region where the white matter and the gray matter exhibit a net-like arrangement is the reticular formation. The ascending portion of the reticular formation is called reticular activating system, that's RAS, which consists of sensory axons that project to the cerebral cortex both directly and through the thalamus, right? The most important function of RAS, reticular activating system, is consciousness, a state of wakefulness in which an individual is fully alert, aware, and oriented. Visual and auditory stimuli and mental activities can stimulate RAS to help maintain consciousness, and that's why when you're meditating you personally feel that you are helping your consciousness to stay alert, so that's good. All right, so RAS is also active during arousal or awakening from sleep. So RAS actually gets activated when you're waking up and also when you're sleeping. Another function of RAS, reticular activating system, is to help maintain attention, concentrating on a single object or thought and alertness, right? So when you're trying to focus, the reticular activating system is actually helping you. The RAS also prevents sensory overload, excessive visual and auditory stimulation by filtering out insignificant information so that it does not reach the consciousness, right? So it is very important to understand what you feed to your brain, right? Inactivation of the RAS produces sleep, a state of partial consciousness from which an individual can be aroused, right? So inactivation of RAS produces sleep, okay? So you go to sleep when you inactivate the RAS, right? Damage to the RAS, on the other hand, results in coma, right? A state of unconsciousness from which an individual cannot be aroused, right? In the lighter stages of coma, brainstem and spinal cord reflexes persist, but in the deepest states, even those reflexes are lost, and if respiratory cardiovascular controls are lost, the patient dies. Descending portion of RAS has connections to the cerebellum and the spinal cord and helps regulate muscle tone, the slight degree of involuntary contraction in the normal resting skeletal muscles. This portion of the RAS also assists in the regulation of heart rate, blood pressure, and respiratory rate. Even though the RAS, reticular activating system, receives input from the eyes, ears, and other sensory receptors, there is no input from receptors for the sense of smell. Even strong odors may fail to cause arousal. Right? So even though the RAS receives input from the eyes, ears, and other sensory receptors, there is no input from receptors for the sense of smell. Even strong odors may fail to cause arousal. People who die in house fires usually succumb to smoke inhalation without awakening, For these reasons, all sleeping areas should have a nearby smoke detector that emits a loud alarm. So smoke detectors are very important. A vibrating pillow or flashing light can serve the same purpose for those who are hearing impaired. Alright, the cerebellum, right? The highly folded surface that greatly increases the surface area of its outer gray matter cortex, allowing for a greater number of neurons. Tenth of the brain mass, yet contains nearly half of the neurons in the brain. A deep groove known as transverse fissure, along with tentorium cerebelli, which supports the posterior part of the cerebrum, separates the cerebellum from the cerebrum. Cerebellum looks like a butterfly, superior and inferior view. The central constricted area is the vermis, which means the worm, and lateral wings are lobes, or lobes are the cerebellar hemispheres. The anterior lobe and posterior lobe govern subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle movements. The lobe, the flocculonodular, flocculo means wool, like tuft, on the interior surface contributes to equilibrium and balance. The superficial layer of the cerebellum, called the cerebral cortex, consists of gray matter and a series of slender parallel folds called folia, which means leaves. So superficial layer of the cerebellum, called the cerebral cortex, consists of gray matter and a series of slender parallel folds called folia. Like foliage. Alright, deep to the gray matter are tracts of white matter called arbor vitae, a tree of life, that resembles branches of tree. Even deeper within the white matter are the cerebellar nuclei, regions of gray matter that give rise to axons, carrying impulses from the cerebellum to the other brain centers. 3 pair cerebellar peduncles attach the cerebellum to the brainstem. These bundles of white matter consist of axons that conduct impulses between the cerebellum and the other parts of the brain. The superior cerebellar peduncles contain axons that extend from the cerebellum to the red nuclei of the midbrain and to several nuclei of the thalamus. The middle cerebellar peduncles are the largest peduncles. Their axons carry impulses for voluntary movements from the pontine nuclei, which receive input from the motor areas of the cerebral cortex into the cerebellum. The inferior cerebellar peduncles consist of axons of spinocerebellar tracts that carry sensory information into the cerebellum from the proprioceptors in the trunk and limbs. Axons from the vestibular apparatus of the inner ear, from the vestibular nuclei of the medulla and pons that carry sensory information into the cerebellum from proprioceptors in the head. Axons from the inferior olivary nucleus of the medulla that enter the cerebellum and regulate the activity of cerebellar neurons. Axons that extend from cerebellum to the vestibular nuclei of the medulla and pons, and axons that extend from the cerebellum to the reticular formation conduct impulses between the cerebellum and the other parts of the brain. Right, so there are many axons, that actually act as conductors of impulses between cerebellum and other parts of the brain. The primary function of cerebellum is to evaluate how well movements initiated by motor areas in the cerebrum are actually being carried out. When movements initiated by cerebral motor areas are not being carried out correctly, the cerebellum detects the discrepancies, right? It then sends back feedback signals to motor area of the cerebral cortex via its connections to the thalamus. The feedback signals help correct the errors, smooth the movements, and coordinate complex sequences of skeletal muscle contractions. Aside from this coordination of skilled movements, the cerebellum is the main brain region that regulates posture and balance. These aspects of cerebellar function make possible all skilled muscular activities, from catching a baseball to dancing to speaking. The presence of reciprocal connections between the cerebellum and association areas of the cerebral cortex suggests that the cerebellum may also have non-motor functions such as cognition, acquisition of knowledge, and language processing. This view is supported by imaging studies using MRI and PET scans. The studies also suggest that cerebellum may play a role in processing sensory information. Right, so cerebellum may also have non-motor functions such as cognition, acquisition of knowledge, and language processing, right? And cerebellar function make possibly all skill muscular activities from catching a baseball to dancing to speaking. Cerebellum coordinates skill movements and regulates posture and balance, all right? So the worm-like structure right here, this is the wormies. This is the anterior view. So if you look at the cerebellum from the front, this is superior view. So it's here, right? So you're standing here and you're looking at it, but this is the side of the view, right? Okay. So this is the anterior lobe, this is the posterior lobe, and this is the vermis, the worm-like structure. These are cerebral hemisphere, right and left. All right. So now this is the inferior view. As you can see, we can actually see the flocculonodular lobe here, the one that looks like a wool, you know, the tuft, right? This is folia, the foliage. They look leafy, right? So these are folia. These are cerebral peduncles, right? Peduncles means feet, right? So this is superior peduncle. This one is the medial peduncle, the middle. This one's the inferior, all right? So these are the peduncles, and that itself here is a fourth ventricle, all right? This is the view. This is the inferior view, and this is again the vermis that looks like a worm. This is a posterior lobe, right? All right. Okay, so mid-sagittal section of cerebellum and the brain stem, right? So now we have both. This is a mid-sagittal section right in the middle, and this is the view, right? Okay. These little things, as you can see, you don't see it here, but you see it here. You see a pineal gland right here. All right, so here you see a superior colliculus, right? So as you can see here, superior colliculus, right? This is the inferior colliculus, right this part. This is the inferior colliculus. This is superior, this is inferior. If you follow here, this is superior, this is inferior, right? And this is the cerebellum, right? The aqueduct of the midbrain. This is the aqueduct of the midbrain. These are mammillary body, right? So as you can see here, that's the mammillary body, right? Okay. And this one's a pond. As you can see, pond. This is pond. This one's a fourth ventricle. As you can see, this is a fourth ventricle. Arbor vitae, the white matter. Okay, it looks like trees, the tree of life, right? This is the white matter of the cerebellum, right? As you can see, you have arbor vitae right here too. This is the folia, the one that looks like leaf, right? As you can see, it's very close to arbor vitae. That's folia, right? Right here. Cerebellar cortex. This is the cortex. That's a gray matter, right? As you can see, we have gray matter right here too. Okay, this is the real dissection. Okay, that here is the medulla oblongata, right? This is the medulla oblongata, right? And this is pons, and this is medulla oblongata. All right, so this is central canal of the spinal cord. This particular thing is the brain stem. Okay. Clinical connection. Damage to the cerebellum can result in a loss of ability to coordinate muscular movements, a condition called ataxia, all right, without order, right? Blindfolded people with ataxia cannot touch the tip of their nose with a finger because they cannot coordinate the movement with their senses of where a body part is located. Another sign of ataxia is a changed speech pattern due to uncoordinated speech and muscle. Cerebellar damage may also result in staggering or abnormal walking movements. People who consume too much alcohol show signs of ataxia because alcohol inhibits activity of the cerebellum. Such individuals have difficulty in passing sobriety tests. Ataxia can also occur as a result of degenerative diseases, right? MS, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease, trauma, brain tumors, genetic factors, and as a side effect of medication prescribed for bipolar disorders. All right, so Summary functions of brain stem. All right. Uh, Sorry, this is the wrong slide. This is for medulla oblongata, right? So contains sensory. So this is medulla oblongata right here. We saw this part is pons. This part is cerebellum, right? So medulla oblongata contains sensory, motor, descending tracts. Cardiovascular center regulates heartbeat and blood vessel diameter. Medullary respiratory center together with the pons regulates breathing. Contains gracile nucleus, cutinate nucleus, gustatory nucleus, right? Cochlear nuclei and vestibular nuclei. It also contains sensory pathways to the brain. Inferior olivary nucleus provides instructions that cerebellum uses to adjust muscle activity when learning new motor skills. Other nuclei coordinate vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping, right? Contains nuclei of origin for vestibulocochlear, all right? Glossopharyngeal, vagus, 10th, accessory nerve, all right? The 11th accessory nerve, and hypoglossal, the cranial nerve, number 12 nerve, okay? Contains the nuclei of origin for vestibular. So that's where the origin is for all these nerves in medulla oblongata. Reticular formation also in pons, midbrain, diencephalon, functions in consciousness and arousal. So reticular formation is also part of it. Pons, so this area is pons. Contains sensory and motor tracts. Pontine nuclei relay nerve impulses from motor areas of cerebral cortex to cerebellum. Contains vestibular nuclei along with medulla that are part of equilibrium pathway to the brain. Pontine respiratory group together with the medulla helps control breathing. Contains nuclei of origin for trigeminal, abducens, facial, and vestibulocochlear nerves. Midbrain contains sensory and motor tracts. Superior colliculi coordinate movements of head, eyes, and trunk in response to visual stimuli. Inferior colliculi coordinate movements of head, eyes, and trunk in response to auditory stimuli. Substantia nigra and red nucleus contribute to the control of movement. Contains nuclei of origin for oculomotor nerve number 3 and trochlear nerves number 4. All right. Smooths and coordinates contractions of skeletal muscles, regulates posture and balance, and language processing. So that's cerebellum, right? We saw that it was helping with posture and balance. That's cerebellum. All right, so what is diencephalon? Diencephalon includes thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. The diencephalon forms a central core of brain tissue, just superior to the midbrain. It is almost completely surrounded by cerebral hemispheres and contains numerous nuclei involved in a variety of sensory and motor processing between higher and lower brain centers. The diencephalon extends from brain stem to the cerebrum and surrounds the third ventricle. It includes thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. Projecting from the hypothalamus is the hypophysis, right? Or pituitary gland, all right? So hypothalamus has a projection called hypophysis or pituitary gland. Portions of diencephalon in the wall of the third ventricle are called circumventricular organs and will be discussed shortly, right? So we'll be talking about circumventricular organs in the later slides. The optic tracts carrying neurons from the retina enter the diencephalon. So optic tracts carrying neurons from the retina enter the diencephalon. All right, so brain anatomy, diencephalon, as you can see, this particular area is diencephalon, all right, the one that you see in purple. It has epithalamus, thalamus, and hypothalamus, right? So thalamus, hypothalamus, you're below the thalamus, and epithalamus on top of the thalamus, right? As you can see, this part here, we just learned that's cerebellum. This area, brainstem, the one in green. cerebral hemisphere. This is all cerebrum, okay? Sits on top of brainstem. So this is brainstem, excuse me. And the diencephalon sits on top of the brainstem, right? Enclosed by cerebral hemisphere, which is true. You know, you can actually see all the hemispheres are enclosing the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus, right? Thalamus measures about 3 centimeters in length and makes up 80% of the diencephalon. Consists of paired oval masses of gray matter organized into nuclei with interspersed tracts of white matter. A bridge of gray matter, called the interthalamic addition, intermediate mass, joins the right and left halves of thalamus in about 70% of human brains. A vertical V-shaped sheet of white matter called internal medullary lamina divides the gray matter of the right and left sides of the thalamus. It consists of myelinated axons that leave the various thalamic nuclei. Axons that connect to the thalamus and cerebral cortex pass through the internal capsule, a thick band of white matter lateral to the thalamus. What are the functions of the thalamus? The functions of the thalamus are major relay station for most sensory impulses that reach the primary sensory areas of the cerebral cortex from the spinal cord and the brainstem. Contributes to motor functions by transmitting information from the cerebellum and basal nuclei to the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. Relays nerve impulses between different areas of the cerebrum and plays a role in the maintenance of consciousness. The anterior nucleus receives input from the hypothalamus and sends output to the limbic system. It functions in emotions and memory. The medial nuclei receive input from the limbic system and basal nuclei and sends output to the cerebral cortex. They function in emotions, learning, memory, and cognition, thinking and knowing. Nuclei in the lateral group receive input from the limbic system, superior colliculi, and cerebral cortex and send output to the cerebral cortex. All right. Functions of thalamus are lateral dorsal nucleus functions in expressing emotion. So expression of emotions is taken care of by lateral dorsal nucleus. Lateral posterior nucleus and pulvinar nucleus help integrate sensory information. 5 nuclei are part of the ventral group. The ventral anterior nucleus receives input from the basal nuclei and sends output to the motor areas of cerebral cortex. It plays a role in movement control. The ventral lateral nucleus receives input from the cerebellum and basal nuclei, sends output to the motor areas of the cerebral cortex. It also plays a role in the movement control. The ventral posterior nucleus relays impulses for somatic sensations such as touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temperature, pain, proprioception from the face and body to the cerebral cortex. The lateral geniculate nucleus, bent like a knee, relays visual impulses for sight from the retina to the primary visual area of the cerebral cortex. The medial geniculate nucleus relays auditory impulses for hearing from the ear to the primary auditory area of the cerebral cortex. So the medial geniculate nucleus, lateral, ventral, posterior, then we have ventral lateral, ventral anterior nucleus, and then we have lateral dorsal and lateral posterior nucleus. With pulvinar nucleus, and they all are responsible for some sort of integration of information, right? All the sensories. As you can see, we have anterior, it's sending output of motor areas of cerebral cortex, plays a role in movement control, right? And then we have ventral lateral nucleus, which is also playing a role in movement control. Ventral posterior nucleus, which helps in relaying impulses, right? For example, touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temp, pain, proprioception from the face and the body to cerebral. We have geniculate nucleus, bent like a knee, relays visual impulses for sight from the retina to the primary visual area. Medial geniculate nucleus relays auditory impulses for hearing from the ear to the primary auditory area of the cerebral cortex. All right, intralaminar nuclei lie within the internal medullary lamina and make connections with the reticular formation, cerebellum, basal nuclei, and wide areas of the cerebral cortex. They function in arousal, activation of cerebral cortex from the brainstem, reticular formation, and integration of sensory and motor information. The midline nucleus forms a thin band adjacent to third ventricle and has a presumed function in memory and olfaction. The reticular nucleus surrounds the lateral aspect of the thalamus next to the internal capsule. This nucleus monitors, filters, and integrates activities of the other thalamic nuclei. All right. So this is how a thalamus looks like. The thalamus is the principal relay station for sensory impulses that reach the cerebral cortex from the other parts of the brain and the spinal cord, right? So this particular area is central sulcus. This here is thalamus. This is interthalamic adhesion. So this particular area is the thalamus. So this is a lateral view. This is a median view, right? All right. So this is reticular. That's the midline. That is internal medullary lamina. That's lateral posterior. These are the pulvinar nuclei. This is medial geniculate nuclei. That's a lateral geniculate nuclei. That's a ventral posterior. That's a ventral lateral, right? That's because this is a superior lateral, right? So this is ventral lateral. This is lateral dorsal, right? This is lateral but dorsal. Or this is ventral anterior. So this is ventral, but this is anterior. Interthalamic adhesion, right? So this is internal thalamic adhesion. That's medial, right? And this is anterior, right? As you can see, this is the internal medullary lamina. These are all intralaminar, 1, 2, 3. This particular is reticular. Now, this is a transverse section of the right side of the thalamus showing location of thalamic nuclei, right? So we saw ventral posterior. So this is right here. We have ventral posterior here, right? This red one is reticular, right? This is reticular. This is lateral posterior. These little ones are pulvinar, right? We saw the same here. So this is internal medullary lamina. All right, so hypothalamus, right? So, all right, so this is the hypothalamus. As you can see, hypothalamus controls many body activities, and it is a very important regulator for hypothalamus, for homeostasis, right? So interthalamic adhesion of thalamus, right? This is dorsal-medial nucleus. This is posterior hypothalamic nucleus, this particular one. Ventral-medial nucleus. This particular is ventral-medial nucleus. This one is arcuate nucleus. This one here is the mammillary body, and this one here is the pons, okay? Corpus callosum here. Paraventricular nucleus. This particular nucleus is paraventricular. This one is lateral preoptic nucleus. This one is medial preoptic nucleus. This particular one. Anterior hypothalamic nucleus. This particular. All right. Suprachiasmatic nucleus here. Supraoptic nucleus. They here. And optic chiasma. Right. This particular one is the optic chiasm. A sagittal section of brain showing hypothalamic nuclei. So this is the sagittal section. All right. You're more than welcome to write it in the comment. What are the 4 major regions of hypothalamus from posterior to anterior? So this is anterior, this is posterior. So you have to go like this. Okay. So it can be posterior hypothalamic nucleus. It can be ventral medial. Okay, it can be arcuate nucleus. You can say suprachiasmatic nucleus. You can also say supraoptic nucleus. You can also say lateral preoptic nucleus, right? So you have to go from posterior to anterior. Okay. A small part of the diencephalon located inferior to the thalamus, hypo is below, right, under. It is composed of dozen or so nuclei in 4 major regions. So we learned mammillary region, right, nipple shaped. Adjacent to midbrain is the most posterior part of hypothalamus. It includes the mammillary bodies and posterior hypothalamic nucleus. The mammillary bodies are two small rounded projections that serve as relay stations for reflexes related to the sense of smell. Tuberal region, the widest part of the hypothalamus, includes the dorsomedial nucleus, ventromedial nucleus, and arcuate nucleus, plus the stalk-like infundibulum funnel, right, which connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus. The median eminence is a slight raised region that encircles the infundibulum. Hypothalamus. The supraoptic region lies superior to the optic chiasm, the point of crossing of optic nerves, and contains the paraventricular nucleus, supraoptic nucleus, interior hypothalamic nucleus, and suprachiasmatic nucleus. Axons from the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei form the hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract, which extends through the infundibulum to the posterior lobe of the pituitary. The preoptic region, anterior to the supraoptic region, is usually considered part of the hypothalamus because it participates with the hypothalamus in regulating certain autonomic activities. The preoptic region contains the medial and lateral preoptic nuclei, right? So here, as you can see, this is the hypothalamus, right? And it is responsible for homeostasis, so too warm. So it provides cooling response, all right? So what happens then? The blood vessels dilate, right? The skin perspires, all right, through sweat glands. The breathing rate increases. The muscles start to shiver, right? So this is the cooling response where the skin perspires, right? The blood vessels constrict. This is a warming response. Muscles shiver, right? So let's say you're getting cold, so you have to get warmed up. Thyroid hormones increase the body's metabolic rate. So it does both the jobs. So it does the positive job and the negative job. So let's say it's very cold. It will, make sure that you start feeling warm. And if you're very warm, it makes sure that you start having cooling response, by sweating, right? Etc. So let's say if it's very cold, you can also start shivering. That's the body's mechanism to increase the heat in the body. Functions of hypothalamus, right? The hypothalamus controls and integrates activities of ANS, which regulates contraction of smooth muscle and cardiac muscle and the secretions of many glands. Axons extend from the hypothalamus to parasympathetic and sympathetic nuclei in the brainstem and the spinal cord. Through the ANS, the hypothalamus is a major regulator of visceral activities, including regulation of heart rate, movement of food through the gastrointestinal tract, and contraction of the urinary bladder, right? So sympathetic nervous system, this is parasympathetic nervous system, both the part of autonomic nervous system, right? So fight, flight, or freeze. Parasympathetic is rest and digest, right? So the fight, flight, or freeze is norepinephrine and epinephrine, whereas rest and digest is acetylcholine, right? So flight or fight or freeze may increase heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, and pupil dilation, and what decreases digestion and urine production, right? Parasympathetic increases digestion. You start eating. So let's say you're chilling at home. Chances are you will get hungry a lot. Why? Because you don't have anything to do. Just go ahead in the kitchen pantry and start eating. It decreases heart rate, respiratory rate, blood pressure, and pupil dilation because you're chilling at home, right? You only start pupil dilation during flight or fight, especially, let's say you saw something coming towards you and you felt like it was going to harm you. That's when your fight or flight gets kicked in, right? Production of hormones. The hypothalamus produces several hormones and it has two types of important connections with the pituitary gland and endocrine gland located inferior to the hypothalamus. First, hypothalamic hormones known as releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones are released into capillary networks in the median eminence, right? The bloodstream carries these hormones directly to the anterior lobe of the pituitary. where they stimulate or inhibit secretion of anterior pituitary hormones. Second, axons extend from paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei through the infundibulum into the posterior lobe of the pituitary. The cell bodies of these neurons make one of two hormones, oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone. Their axons transport the hormones to the posterior pituitary where they are released. Okay, hypothalamus releasing hormones. It's turned on, and it's sent. The signals are sent to anterior pituitary, and then anterior pituitary actually sends it to systemic target organs. That can be liver, that can be kidney, that can be your heart, etc. So inhibiting hormones would turn it off. Inhibiting hormones would not take anything, because you have to inhibit the process. So even if there's an incoming message, the outgoing relaying would stop. Okay. All right. Regulation of emotional and behavioral patterns together with the limbic system, which we will be discussing in the next video. The hypothalamus participates in expressions of rage, aggression, pain, and pleasure, and the behavioral patterns related to sexual arousal, right? Emotion circuit, stress, cortical limbic system. Now that connects to mind-body connection through hypothalamus. And the circuit controlling body functions is the hypothalamic limbic circuit system, the cortical limbic circuit system. We also have sympathetic nervous system where the heart rate would actually go up, the blood pressure would go up, and that increases body temp. All right, so heat production, brown fat, right? And that's why many people say, why you got so skinny after working at an XYZ location, because chances your blood pressure was always high and you were burning a lot of fats, right? And somewhere I feel, the way our body deals with stress is, let's say, by avoiding the stressor. Something is not right for you, or the particular Xerox machine is broken, let me not just go there. If not, then I'll get real stressed out, right? So at times, hypothalamus also helps us avoid certain things, okay? Regulation of eating and drinking. Hypothalamus regulates food intake. It contains a feeding center which promotes eating, and a satiety center which causes a sensation of fullness and cessation of eating. So for those that are actually fat, somewhere I feel it's a hypothalamus that is to blame. And it also contains thirst center, right? The people that may have diabetes, they would have a lot of longing for drinking water. They will be thirsty all the time, right? And at the same time, hungry all the time, right? When certain cells in the hypothalamus are stimulated by raising osmotic pressure of the extracellular fluid, they cause the sensation of thirst. The intake of water by drinking restores osmotic pressure to normal, removing the stimulation and relieving the thirst, right? So this is the brain circuit for hunger response, right? As you can see, ghrelin is making sure that you sense hunger, and it's sent to hypothalamus. Hypothalamus, sends a message that, hey, the patient's hungry, and that's when the reticular activating system gets activated. The somatic motor nerves would send that information, to start masticating or feeding. The sympathetic would, decrease the metabolism, so it's negative or positive, At times, the stopping of hypothalamus may even have an impact, because now your hypothalamus is not sending any signals for eating, to feed. And that's why the metabolism would decrease. All right. Control of body temp. The hypothalamus also functions as body thermostat, which senses the body temp so that it is maintained at a desired set point. If the temperature of blood flowing through the hypothalamus is above normal, the hypothalamus directs the autonomic nervous system to stimulate activities that promote heat loss. When blood temp is below normal, by contrast, the hypothalamus generates impulses that promote heat production and retention, right? So, central thermoreceptors, hypothalamus, the peripheral thermoreceptors, the thermal temperature reduction mechanism. If it's hot, sweat glands. You start perspiring. If it's cold, temperature generation mechanism, the brown adipose tissue, the somatic muscles, you start shivering, and you also start producing heat. Yeah, so vasodilation, vasoconstriction, noradrenergic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system, right? And here, for somatic muscles, the somatic neurons get activated, right? Here, as you can see, cholinergic neurons of the sympathetic nervous system get activated during vasodilation and transpiration. Regulation of circadian rhythms, right? So hypothalamus also takes care of that. The suprachiasmatic nucleus and SCN of the hypothalamus serves as the body's internal biological clock because it establishes circadian rhythm, the daily rhythms, patterns of biological activity such as sleep-wake cycle that occur on circadian schedule cycle of about 24 hours. This nucleus receives inputs from the eyes, retina, and sends output to other hypothalamic nuclei, the reticular formation, and also the pineal gland. Right? The visual input to the SCN synchronizes the neurons of SCN to the light-dark cycle associated with day and night. Without this input, the SCN still promotes biological rhythms, but the rhythm become progressively out of sync with the normal light-dark cycle because the inherent activity of the SCN creates cycles that last about 25 hours instead of 24. Therefore, the SCN must receive light-dark cues from the external environment in order to create rhythms that occur on a 24-hour cycle. Try to sleep with the lights on, and you will realize that you have created a functional issue with the circadian rhythm because the hypothalamus may not really get the information that it's actually day and not night, okay? Or it's actually night and not day. Why? Because the lights would be on. Okay? The mechanism responsible for internal clock in an SCN neuron is due to the rhythmic turning on and off of a clock gene in the cell's nucleus, resulting in the alternating levels of clock proteins in the cell's cytosol. The clock genes are self-starting. They are turned on automatically and then are transcribed and translated. The resulting clock proteins accumulate in the cytosol and then enter the nucleus to turn off the clock genes. Gradually, the clock proteins degrade, and without these proteins present, the clock genes are activated again, and the cycle repeats with each corresponding to 24 hours period. The alternating levels of clock proteins cause rhythmic changes in the output of SCN neurons, which in turn causes rhythmic changes in other parts of the body, especially the pineal gland. So this particular area is the epithalamus, above thalamus. This, as we saw, is pineal gland. Right? This particular cerebellum, thalamus. This area is the thalamus. This area is the hypothalamus. This area is corpus callosum, cerebral cortex. This particular area is cerebral cortex. Epithalamus, the small region superior and posterior to the thalamus, consists of pineal gland and habenuclear nuclei. The pineal gland, the pine cone-like, is about size of small pea and protrudes from the posterior midline of the third ventricle. The pineal gland is a part of endocrine system because it secretes the hormone melatonin. The melatonin helps regulate circadian rhythms, which, as you have just learned, are established by the suprachiasmatic nucleus, SCN of the hypothalamus, in response to the visual input from the eyes. Retina, the SCN stimulates the pineal gland via neural connections, right? With the sympathetic neurons of the autonomic nervous system to secrete the hormone melatonin in a rhythmic pattern, with low levels of melatonin secreted during the day and significantly higher level secreted at night. Why? Because melatonin helps us to go to sleep and also stay asleep, okay? The changing levels of melatonin in turn promote rhythmic changes in sleep, wakefulness, hormone secretion, and body temp. In addition to its role in regulating circadian rhythms, melatonin is involved in other functions. It induces sleep, serves as an antioxidant, and inhibits the reproductive function in certain animals. As more melatonin is liberated during darkness than in light, this hormone is thought to promote sleepiness, right? So melatonin helps promote sleepiness, and this is exactly why we see a lot of teas that may have melatonin in it. When taken orally, melatonin also appears to contribute to the setting of the body's biological clock by inducing sleep and helping the body to adjust to jet lag. The habenular nuclei are involved in all affection, especially emotional responses to odors such as loved. Okay, so for example, uh, you love someone, so that's when the emotional response would get triggered. Especially, let's say you just adopted a puppy and you like the smell of the puppy. That's when olfaction comes into picture. With at the same time, serotonin comes into picture, right? So there's an emotional response to the odor. Parts of the diencephalon called circumventricular organs, CVOs, because they line the wall of third ventricle, can monitor chemical changes in the blood because they lack a blood-brain barrier. So CVO, they lack blood-brain barrier. Includes part of hypothalamus, the pineal gland, the pituitary gland, and a few other nearby structures. Functionally, these regions coordinate homeostatic activities of the endocrine and nervous system, such as the regulation of blood pressure, fluid balance, hunger, and thirst. Sites of entry into the brain of HIV, the virus that causes AIDS. Once in the brain, HIV may cause dementia, irreversible deterioration of mental state, and other neurological disorders. All right. So these are all the circumventricular organs. Why? Because they lack blood-brain barrier, which means they lack the tight junctions between their between their endothelial cells. Right. So this is pineal gland. Subfornical organ. This is organum vasculosum of the lamina terminalis. This particular. That is the pituitary gland. This is the median eminence of the hypothalamus. That is area postrema. This particular, it's a part of inferior cerebellum, right? And so the blood's CSF barrier, highly vascularized, continuous lining of endothelial cells, small pores. It is fenestrated, which means it has small pores, right? The cerebrum, right? So what is the cerebrum? The cerebrum is a seat of intelligence. As you can see, cerebrum is really large with multiple lobes, right? It provides us with the ability to read, write, speak, to make calculation and compose music, to remember the past, plan for future, imagine things that have never existed before, right? That happens too. The cerebrum consists of an outer cerebral cortex, an internal region of cerebral white matter and gray matter nuclei deep within the white matter. So as you can see, this is the frontal, it's parietal in green, occipital lobe in blue, and temporal lobe in purple, right? This is the left hemisphere, this is the right hemisphere. Sulcus and gyrus, right? So this is the brain superior view. This is brain lateral view on the sides. All right? So as you can see, cerebrum has multiple fissures, like we just had conversation before. Longitudinal fissure right here. Cerebral veins and arteries covered by the arachnoid matter, right? As you can see, these are cerebral veins. Left cerebral hemisphere, this area is left, this area is right, right? This particular area is the occipital lobe. This is parietal lobe, and this is frontal lobe. Cerebral cortex, all right? The cerebral cortex is called cortex of the rind or bark, right? Is a region of gray matter that forms the outer rim of the cerebrum. Although only 2 to 5 millimeter, 0.08 to 0.16 inch thick, the cerebral cortex contains billions of neurons arranged in distinct layers, right? During embryonic development, when brain size increases rapidly, the gray matter of the cortex enlarges much faster than the deeper white matter. As a result, the cortical region rolls and folds on itself, right? The folds are called gyri, right, which means circles. Singular is gyrus or convolutions, right? The deepest grooves between folds are known as fissures. The shallower grooves between folds are termed sulci. That's sulcus, right? Singular. The most prominent fissures are longitudinal fissures that separate cerebrum and left half called cerebral hemisphere. Within the longitudinal fissure between cerebral hemisphere is the falx cerebri. The cerebral hemispheres are connected internally by corpus callosum, right? We saw corpus callosum. Corpus body and callosum means heart. A broad band of white matter containing axons that extend between the hemisphere. All right. The cerebrum is the seat of intelligence. It provides the ability to read, all right, and speak, to make calculations and compose music, to arrange the past and plan for the future, and to create, right? So this is the gyrus, as you can see the folds. This is sulcus, as you can see the groove, okay? This is cerebral cortex, the one in pink. The inside is cerebral white matter. As you can see, this is the longitudinal fissure, right? All right, so this is a frontal bone, a frontal lobe. This is anterior. So you're looking at, this is superior view from the anterior side, right? So this is frontal, this is parietal, and this is occipital, okay? All right. So brain folds, shallow grooves, and deep grooves cause, or the brain folds are gyri or gyrus. Shallow grooves are sulcus, all right? So these are central sulcus. These are precentral gyrus, this area. That's the frontal lobe. That's insula projected to the surface. Lateral cerebral sulcus, the temporal lobe. This particular area is temporal lobe. This particular area is cerebellum. This one is transverse fissure, right? Here we saw in the middle, right here, that was a longitudinal fissure, right? Occipital lobe, this is parietal occipital sulcus. That one in blue is parietal lobe, and that is post-central gyrus, the folds, okay? The central sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The major gyrus, the precentral gyrus, located immediately anterior to the central sulcus, contains the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. Another major gyrus, the postcentral gyrus, which is located immediately posterior to the central sulcus, contains the primary somatosensory area of the cerebral cortex. The lateral cerebral sulcus separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe. The parietal occipital sulcus separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. A fifth part of the cerebrum, the insula, cannot be seen at the surface of the brain because it lies within the lateral cerebral sulcus, deep to the parietal, frontal, and temporal lobes. The cerebral white matter. Okay, cerebral white matter consists of primarily myelinated axons in three types of tracts. So one is association, another one is commissarial, and another is projection tracts. The association tract contain axons that conduct nerve impulses between gyri and the same hemisphere. Right, the commissarial tracts contain axons that conduct nerve impulses from gyri in one cerebral hemisphere to the corresponding gyri in the other cerebral hemisphere. The three important groups of commissarial tracts are the corpus callosum, the largest fiber bundle of the brain, containing about 300 million fibers, anterior commissure and posterior commissure. Projection tracts contain axons that conduct nerve impulses from the cerebrum to the lower parts of the CNS, thalamus, brainstem, or spinal cord, or from lower parts of the CNS to the cerebrum. Alright, so cerebral white matter, association tracts, commissurial tracts, and projection tracts from white matter tracts in the cerebral hemisphere. So this particular area is a mid-sagittal plane, right? And this is how you're seeing the sagittal plane after you cut through the mid-sagittal area. So these are the association tracts. That is the cerebral cortex. These are commissurial and projection tracts, right? All right, so commissurial tracts also include corpus callosum. They include anterior commissure, right? This particular area is the mammillary body. Septum pellucidum. This area is a septum pellucidum. So this is the association tract. This is the commissural and projection tract, right? The basal nuclei, right? The basal nuclei help initiate terminative movements, suppress unwanted movements, and regulate muscle tone, right? So this is the lateral ventricle. This is thalamus. This is tail of caudate nucleus. These ones are occipital lobe of cerebrum, right? So that's the occipital lobe of cerebrum. All right, so body of caudate nucleus, this particular area, right? It's a part of transparent brain, right? This is putamen, and that's the head of caudate nucleus. This particular, here, the frontal lobe of cerebellum. This is the frontal lobe. All right, so this is the superior view, okay? So as you can see, this basal nuclei, there are three main parts of basal nuclei. Caudate nucleus, one is putamen, and another is globus pallidus. All right, so this one's globus pallidus. These here are optic tracts. All right, and this is hypothalamus and associated nuclei here. Okay. So what is basal nuclei? Deep within each cerebral hemisphere are three nuclei, mass of gray matter, and they are collectively termed as basal nuclei, right? Two of the basal nuclei lie side by side, just lateral to the thalamus. They are globus pallidus, all right? Globus is ball, pallidus is pale, so which is closer to the thalamus, and putamen, which is like shell, which is closer to the cerebral cortex. Together, the globus pallidus and putamen are referred to as the lentiform nucleus, shaped like a lens. The third of the basal nuclei is the caudate nucleus. Caudate nucleus is tail, right? Cauda equina, right? Remember, horse's tail, which has a large head connected to a smaller tail by a long comma-shaped body, right? Together, the lentiform and caudate nuclei are known as corpus striatum, right? So corpus is body, striatum is striated, so striated body, right? So let's say caudate nucleus. So this is caudate nucleus, as you can see, yeah? That is the putamen. That is globus pallidus, the ball, right? Remember? We just learned. All right, the ball, pallidus, the pale colored ball, okay? The term corpus striatum refers to striated, striped appearance of internal capsule as it passes among the basal nuclei. The nearby structures that are functionally linked to the basal nuclei are substantia nigra of the midbrain and subthalamic nuclei of the diencephalon. Axons from substantia nigra terminate in the caudate nucleus and putamen. The subthalamic nuclei interconnect with the globus pallidus. The claustrum is a thin sheet of gray matter situated lateral to the putamen. It is considered by some to be a subdivision of the basal nuclei. The function of claustrum in humans has not been clearly defined, but it may be involved in visual attention. What are the functions of basal nuclei? Basal nuclei receive input from the cerebral cortex, provide output to the motor parts of the cortex via the medial and ventral group of the nuclei, group nuclei of the thalamus. A major function of the basal nuclei is to help regulate initiation and termination of movements. Activity of neurons in the putamen precedes or anticipates body movements. Activity of neurons in the caudate nucleus occurs prior to eye movements. The globus pallidus helps regulate the muscle tone required for specific body movements. The basal nuclei also control subconscious contractions of the skeletal muscles. In addition to the influencing motor functions, the basal nuclei also have other roles. All right, they help in initiate and terminate some cognitive processes, attention, memory, and planning, and may act with the limbic system to regulate emotional behaviors disorders such as Parkinson's disease, OCD, schizophrenia, and chronic anxieties are thought to involve dysfunctions of circuits between basal nuclei and the limbic system, right? All right, so what are the function areas of cerebrum, right? So this is the cerebrum. What are the function areas? This is the primary motor cortex, voluntary movement, right close to central sulcus, or primary somatosensory cortex, aesthetic sensation proprioception, right? This is sensory association areas of integration of sensory information. This here is a visual association area, so higher vision processing. This one is primary visual cortex. This area in orange is the Wernicke's area for language comprehension. This particular area is auditory association area. This particular area, in purple is primary auditory cortex, right? This particular area. The limbic association cortex, emotions, learning, and memory. This particular area is limbic association cortex. This is for smell. This little one is olfactory cortex. Smell, olfaction means smelling something. Broca's area is speech formation right here. Prefrontal association areas, idea and plan for voluntary movement, thoughts, and personalities. Okay, so the prefrontal association. Premotor cortex coordinates voluntary movements, right? Okay, so thank you very much. If you really liked this lecture, please like and subscribe. Bye.